Last time we talked about the Stone Age people and how they were hunter-gatherers and they would follow the animals in the water to move around. And now we're going to talk about where people moved, how they moved, and how they adapted to the environment as they moved around. So on your guys' assignment, you have a note sheet that looks just like this, but yours has text boxes on it. And so you're going to be listening and following along as I read from our textbook. The first thing you're going to be listening for is ice ages, migrate, and land bridge. You're going to be listening for those three definitions. In our book, the vocabulary words are highlighted yellow, and then the definition follows. So these three words will be highlighted yellow, and you'll be looking for those definitions and filling them in. And then the next part we read will be about how they adapted to the environment when they moved. So they needed to stay blank. You're going to listen to how they needed to stay and how they stayed that way. They learned to do something and they made something to help them with that. And then we're going to provide examples down here. And then we're also going to read about the new types of tools that they made after they moved from Africa. They used blank and blank to make the tools. So you're going to fill in what they used to make the tools. And then these are different inventions they came up with as well. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6 different inventions you're going to be listening for. So follow along on your note sheet as I read out of our book. So we see people move out of Africa. During the Old Stone Age, climate patterns around the world changed, transforming the Earth's geography. In response to these changes, people began to migrate or move to new places. So when they migrated, they moved to new places. So the definition of migrate is move to new places. Most scientists believe, maybe around 106 million years ago, many of the places began to experience long periods of freezing weather. These long periods of freezing weather are called the ice ages. So the ice ages are long periods of freezing weather. So the definition of ice ages is long periods of freezing weather. During the ice ages, huge sheets of ice covered a lot more of the earth. These sheets were formed from ocean water, which left the ocean levels lower than they are now. Many areas that are now underwater were dry land then. For example, a narrow body of water now separates Asia and North America. But scientists think that during the ice ages, the ocean level dropped and exposed a land bridge, a strip of land connecting two continents. Land bridges allowed Stone Age people to migrate around the world. So we have a picture here on our book. As you can see, we have North America right here, and we have Asia over here. So you can see there's not much space. It's about 55 miles between Alaska and Asia. And so when this part of the world formed in ice, it made those water level drops and exposed this land here, which allowed the people to move from Africa to over here, and allowed them to cross over to come to the Americas. So this land bridge has a thin strip of land connecting two continents. Now we're going to see how they adapted as they moved, because looking at the weather here, you have really warm environment, and if they're moving and traveling up here, this is where it gets cold and snowy. So how they were living down here cannot be the same way they live here. They would not be as warm, they would not have the right kind of shelter, clothes, tools. So they had to learn to do things differently up here, and we're going to learn how they did that. Now we're looking at people adapt to new environments. As early people moved to new lands, they found environments that differed greatly from those in East Africa. Many places were much colder and had strange plants and animals. Early people had to learn to adapt to their new environment. Although fire helped keep people warm in very cold areas, people needed more protection. To keep warm, they learned to sew animal skins together to make clothing. So after they migrated out of Africa, people needed to stay warm. They needed to stay warm. And so one way they did that, we just saw that they learned to sew skins together to make clothing. So they learned to make new clothing. So after migrating out of Africa, people needed to stay warm, and they learned to make new warm clothing from animal skins. But in another way they stayed warm, so in addition to clothing, people needed shelter to survive. So they also made new shelters. So after migrating out of Africa, people needed to stay warm. They learned to make new clothes, and they made shelters. And now we're going to listen for 3 different examples of what type of shelters they made. At first, they took shelter in caves. So one example of a shelter is a cave. When they moved to areas with no caves, they built their own shelters. The first human-made shelter were called pit houses. They were pits in the ground with roofs, branches, and leaves. So another example could be pit houses. So they first started living in caves, but then they started making houses in the ground called pit houses. Later, people began to build homes above the ground. Some lived in tents made out of animal skins. So another example of a shelter that they built was a tent. Others built more permanent structures of wood, stone, clay, or other materials. Even bones from large animals such as mammoths were used in building shelters. So another example of a shelter is a wood, stone, or clay house. They use those items to make the houses as well. If we look at this picture over here, we can see one of those houses made out of the mammoth bones. So they took the bones to use as the frame for the shelter, and then they covered it in animal hides. It might have been the mammoth animal hide, maybe some other animals, and they covered it there for a shelter to keep themselves warm and protected. So now we're going to look at the types of tools that they came up with and figured out how to make. So new tools and technologies. Remember, again, we're listening for what 2 things they used to make tools, and then the different inventions that they came up with. People also adapted to new environments with new types of tools. These tools were smaller and more complex than tools from the Old Stone Age. They defined the Mesolithic era, or the Middle Stone Age. This period began more than 10,000 years ago and lasted about 5,000 years ago in some places. During the Middle Stone Age, people found new uses for bone and stone tools. So they used bone and stone to make their tools. So now we're going to look for some different inventions that they came up with. So people who lived near water invented hooks. The first example is hooks and fishing spears. So they came up with hooks and fishing spears. Other groups invented the bow and arrow. So they also came up with the bow and arrow. So far, new inventions we have is hooks, fishing spears, bow and arrow. Now we're going to look at some more inventions. In addition to tools, people developed new technologies to improve their lives. For example, some learned to make canoes by hollowing out logs. So another invention is canoes. They used the canoes to travel on rivers and lakes. They also began to make pottery. So another invention is pottery. They were able to then, transport water, store food, store different items. So pottery is another invention. And finally, The first pets may have also appeared at this time. People kept dogs to help them hunt and for protection. So they had dogs for hunting and protection. So they came up with several different inventions. They had hooks, fishing spears, bow and arrow, canoes, pottery, dogs for hunting and protection. Developments like these, in addition to clothing and shelter, allowed people to adapt to new environments. Early people adapted to new environments with new kinds of clothing, shelter, and tools. And then in the next section, we're going to read about how they developed farming. So go through and make sure you got all of the blanks filled in as you were listening to me read this section of the book. And then once you finish that, make sure you click turn it in once it's all filled out. And again, any questions you have or anything that doesn't quite clear to you, send me a message in Teams, send me a message on Remind, or send me a message through email.